Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Walsh from the Weather Channel with our inaugural first ever forecast factor Periscope. This is a bit of an experiment, so it's going to look a little bit like a hostage video, but it really isn't. It's basically our first attempt to leverage this technology to sort of communicate what we're thinking about as it relates to weather and consumers and business and sort of all things that are related to the weather and how it's propelling all of us to live our lives. I thought what I'd do on this first one is just give you a quick overview of what the forecast factor is. Well, it's actually a couple of things. First and foremost, it's a new blog that we started, I guess it was last August, and it's really focused specifically on how weather's influencing consumers, how weather's influencing, or how I should say, how the weather influencing consumers is influencing different industry sectors. And we use it to communicate to our business customers to help them better assess what the impact of the weather has been and what it will be to help them basically plan their businesses accordingly. In addition to that, I also do, I guess about every 2 weeks or so, we do a forecast factor segment that airs on Wake Up with Al. In fact, I'll be taping my next one on Monday. And so what you're seeing here on the screen is actually the blog, and I've got a couple of stories that I'm covering. As noted earlier I think the Weather Channel tweeted out, we're looking at the hurricane season, and most specifically what looks like it's going to be Tropical Storm Anna, and also the weather for the balance of May. There's a prediction prior to this, if we have time, we'll actually get to, which actually speaks to the expectation that we're going to have a relatively cool summer and what that would mean for businesses and industry. But I think really to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about hurricanes and how we've been sort of looking at this year's hurricane season. And specifically how we've been looking at the forecast of a quiet hurricane season. Specifically, what I've been sort of warning about is the negative impacts of a quiet hurricane season. Because what ends up happening, especially because we've been in this so-called hurricane drought for the last, 8 or 9 years, there's a potential for complacency around that hurricane forecast as people really start to let their guard down when they start to see news about the fact that we may, or I shouldn't say the forecast that we may have a very quiet hurricane season. So for areas like Florida, for example, where there's now somewhere around 1 million people that live in areas that typically get hurricanes that have never experienced a hurricane, they're not really going to be as well prepared as people obviously that have seen storms in the past. So when you layer on top of that a hurricane forecast that says it could be a record low, that has a tendency to sort of perhaps have people let their guards down. So it becomes a pretty risky situation. So what ends up happening then is when you have the first real storms that are impacting large areas, the effect on consumers and the impact on business is actually a lot larger than it would be had we had 1 or 2 storms over the last couple of years. And that means that when we do start to see this activity, the real activity, not necessarily, or the big activity, not necessarily what we're talking about with Anna, although that is a good wake-up call, the effect is enhanced. And so what I've been basically saying is that you should not count on it being a slow hurricane season. If you're in business particularly, and if you have business interests that are in areas that are likely to get hurricanes. Because when the storms start to come, and when the predictions are starting to fly, though the impact of consumers relative to that storm are going to be really, really big, really big. And so it's something that you really have to pay attention to. And businesses more and more are. So the large home centers, the large retail chains, are getting very, very sophisticated in terms of how they are leveraging weather data, how they're leveraging communications data, social media, to both manage their businesses, manage their staff, making sure they have the right kind of products, using data and analytics to really assess what kind of products they're going to need, because we all buy things differently when we're under threat. and also using weather forecasts to manage exactly how long they can stay open for. So they want to keep the doors open as long as they can, and then almost as importantly, timing when they can open the store just as soon as they possibly can, so that they're up and serving their customers. So when you look at those type of technologies and the way that companies are using weather, it becomes really interesting, obviously. But it also becomes very profitable for the businesses and also for all of us. It's also very helpful as well. Now, one of the things that I've been following certainly all spring, of course we've gone through this very cold spring, at least in the Northeast and the Midwest. But the expectation has been that the spring actually nationally would break stronger than it did last year. And the reason is that the cold that we had this year, as bad as it was in the Northeast and Midwest, was nowhere near as cold and snowy as it was last year. So the effect this year was actually not as great as it was last year. It was more regionalized, so it was really focused on the Northeast, especially in Boston, and also the Midwest, but it didn't extend out across the entire country. So we did not have the same level of impact as we did last year. So when we got into late March and we got closer to the Easter holiday and the weather finally broke, the weather actually was a pretty strong tailwind for business. So consumers were out in force and buying, and we had a really strong finish to the first 3 months of the year. Now, as we moved into April, into the second half of April, it actually turned cool again. So that means that businesses and consumers sort of stopped buying, or I should say, slowed down. So I expect that we will have found that retailers in particular would have saw a bit of a slowdown as we moved into April. Now, as we're into May and we've got the first real heat of the year that's really coming on board, I'm expecting that that's going to trigger another surge of consumer spending and consumer demand. So from an economic perspective, I think that we're going to see a good, strong push as we go through the month of May and into June, which will actually be a good tailwind going into the summer. And all of this, by the way, is good for all of us, because to the extent that businesses are benefiting from good weather, they're doing more profitable sales. That helps the stock market, which ultimately helps all of us. So I'm very bullish for May. If you go to the Forecast Factor site, you can see the post that we did a couple of days ago, really speaking to all of those points, and the fact that we now have this really warm weather coming on board with a bunch of about 4 different factors that are really sort of weighing into the fact that this is really going to be beneficial for the economy as we move forward. And then yesterday, I think I posted what I called my alert of the first tropical cyclone of the season. Of course, this goes back to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago as it relates to the forecast of the so-called quiet hurricane season. This is a really strong wake-up call. While this won't be a major hurricane that will be impacting the U.S., it is certainly a wake-up call. It'll add a number to the forecasts that have been out there. So Colorado State, even the weather company, all put out hurricane forecasts. By and large, the forecasts are all looking for a quiet season that's related to the El Nino. There's a lot of things that are going on that are really flavoring that forecast. And more than likely, we will see that when the season is over, we will probably have a lower number than we might normally have. But the risk is that we have no idea where those storms will go. So it could very well be that we end up with a quiet year in terms of storms, but we end up with a very active year in terms of the number of storms that actually interacted with the U.S. And when you think about the fact that we've been in this hurricane drought for a long time, it just seems like that isn't going to last forever, and that our luck is going to run out soon, and this could be the year. And so I continue to basically throw out the flag that this is a potentially risky year. Certainly riskier as it relates to the potential impact for the populations that are involved, or that will be in the front of these storms, and certainly from a business, even a small business perspective, and an economic perspective for that matter, we're setting up for a very potentially volatile year related to hurricanes. Okay, so that is it. So the thing for tomorrow, we're going to be doing a new post which is something new. It's called the Weekly Weather and Business Headline Roundup. This basically is going to be the stories for the prior week that basically speak to weather and its impact on business. Quite a few interesting stories out there, so we'll be posting that tomorrow. And then I think I'll probably also post this Periscope on there as well. If you are interested, by the way, in actually subscribing to the Forecast Factor blog, you can do so at www.forecastfactor.weather.com. I told you this is going to look like a hostage video because I'm hand-holding this. All of the content that we put out, a lot of the segments that I do on Weather Channel, there's typically anywhere from say 1 to 4 a week, and almost every Sunday I'll be doing something, although this Sunday probably not, because we're already being preempted because of severe weather. The other shout out I'll give is to the show Weather Geeks, if you're familiar with that, hosted by Dr. Marshall Shepard. I will be on the next segment whenever that airs. It was going to air Sunday, but it's been preempted. And I'll be with Glenn Fitch, who is the IBM's global business leader for analytics, and we're talking about weather and more specifically integrating weather and weather analytics into business. And I think it's going to be a pretty fascinating show if you wanted to dial into that. Okay, so that I think is near the end of it. Actually, I didn't get any questions, so I will we'll save those till next time. And I am going to try to figure out now how to turn this thing off. There we go. Whoops. Bear with me, guys. There we go. Stop broadcast. All right, and then we'll talk next time. See you. Bye.